Hi class, welcome to Chapter 1, an introduction to communication studies and public speaking. So in this presentation, I'll go ahead and cover the areas of communication scholarship so that you have a better idea of what we do as communication scholars and what we explore. We will also define communication and define rhetoric. We'll also talk about models of communication, specifically the linear model of communication that was developed by Aristotle. And then we'll look at a more contemporary model entitled the transactional communication model. We'll also look at the similarities and differences of public speaking and interpersonal communication so that we can take a look at that juxtaposition and understand some of those differences. And lastly, we will speak about public speaking anxiety and different techniques and methods we can employ to reduce our public speaking anxiety. So in this presentation, I'll go through things fairly quickly because you do have the opportunity to pause and rewind this video. But typically in class, I would spend extra time exploring some of these concepts. So what is it that we study in communication studies? So I get this question all the time when I tell people that I teach communication studies. They're like, what is that? Like computer stuff, IT stuff? And it's like, even though we do study computers and technology, it's not everything that we do. And so hopefully in this brief presentation, you'll get a better understanding of what we do as, again, communication scholars. So I am going to begin with the innermost aspect of communication, the communication that is most salient to us, and that is intrapersonal communication. Essentially, scholarship in this field is really interested in exploring how internal dialogue, or our self-talk, influences the perceptions we hold of ourselves and the perceptions of reality around us. And so it's that consciousness, it's that internal dialogue that often shapes everything around us. And so scholarship in this area is really interested in self-talk and how it influences our relationships, our, again, perceptions of ourselves, and all of those fascinating concepts. So great area of scholarship to explore. The next is interpersonal communication. This tends to be my emphasis. This is what I've spent the most time researching in both my undergrad and graduate studies. In my doctoral studies right now, there is a trend of interpersonal communication that I'm exploring, but now it's looking at the broader picture. So my emphasis, or kind of my area of interest right now, has been the intersection between technology and interpersonal relationships, specifically social media, and how social media is changing the way we communicate with others on a very fundamental level. Last semester, I completed a study that is under review for publication that explored how the CDC and the World Health Organization utilize these powerful communication mediums, such as social media platforms, Facebook, Instagram, to communicate COVID-19 related information to the general public. So it took more of like a public relations, organizational, and technological approach to communication. But interpersonal communication, everything from dyadic interactions, like, interacting between you and a partner or a friend or a doctor or the person, at the coffee shop making your coffee, all of those interactions are really fascinating. And there's a ton of theories that are interesting to look at. So within the interpersonal communication, I think the conflict management has been something that I've gravitated towards as well. There's also group and team communication. So understanding that we'll probably spend the rest of our professional working career working with a small group of peers working towards completing projects and a task, it's really important to understand the communication dynamics in order to enhance the effectiveness of group and team communication. Public communication, this is public speaking, rhetoric, all that fun stuff. We'll spend the rest of the semester talking about it, but essentially we will be learning how to develop good ideas, how to develop good structure and good delivery so that we can communicate effectively in a public forum. There's also organizational communication. This explores how organizations communicate within the organization and outside the organization. So I mentioned the last study that I conducted explored the CDC and the World Health Organization, their use of social media to communicate to the rest of us about, this information, health crisis information regarding the current pandemic. Mass communication also looks at radio, televised broadcasts, news outlets, and that gives us a glimpse into how a particular culture or a group of people are interpreting the things that are happening around us. So oftentimes we can look at media portrayals or news reports and see how they are biased or leaning towards a particular narrative. Social media, as I mentioned, is generating a lot of interest within the academic community because it is changing the way we communicate. And not just changing the way we communicate, but it also has deep, profound impacts on our personal lives as well. And so Sherry Turkle, one of the leading scholars at MIT, spent the last 30 years studying technology and how it's shaping our psychology and our behavior. And currently, with too much screen time, we're actually depriving ourselves of moments of clarity and deep reflection. And so Turkle argues that as a result, we aren't developing critical skills such as empathy or perspective taking or even basic conversational skills. And that is profoundly impacting our relationships in a negative way. And so we aren't developing good relationships. We're constantly demanding more of technology and less from others. And it's all shrouded in this illusion of connectivity. And so we feel like we're connected to the people around us. We're on our social media feeds, but really it's a substitute for the real thing. And as a result, we're depriving ourselves opportunities to develop some of these really critical, important skills, not only for success, but also for a satisfying, deep, meaningful life as well. So there are a lot of practical implications with that. Of course, we see the intercultural communication as a field of research. This explores how culture is shaped through communication and how individuals from different cultures or perceptions try to communicate. So again, very relevant in today's diverse society. And we could see intercultural communication overlapping with a lot of these disciplines. So, culture shapes the way we think, it shapes our internal dialogue, culture shapes the way we engage in, dyadic conversations and interpersonal relationships. We're going to be working in very diverse groups and teams with people from different cultural backgrounds, different values, different ways of communicating. We see that as public speakers, it's very important to understand our audience and to identify different cultural demographics so that we can appropriately and effectively reach these individuals and invite them into our presentation. We see organizational communication is really focused on, diversity and inclusion. So we see that intercultural communication studies is applicable to that organizational communication. And then, of course, mass media and social media. So we see that communication studies is a very diverse, applicable field. And so if you were to ask me very simply, what do you do as a communication scholar? I would answer you, we study human behavior. So behavior in terms of interaction. So defining communication, communication is defined as a transactional process of sharing meaning with others. So we use our communication to establish a shared meaning, that symbolic convergence of our experiences. And so that's essentially what communication is. It's sharing our experiences with other people. It's sharing information, but on a deep, profound level. Public speaking is essentially that same thing, but in a more formal manner. So, what is rhetoric? Essentially, rhetoric is speaking or writing in a way that is going to have a profound impact on the audience, or it's language designed to have some sort of persuasive or impressive effect on its audience. So, the origins of rhetoric, we see that the oldest textbook on effective speaking was found in Egypt about 4,500 years ago. Communication studies was born over 2,500 years ago in the 400 BCs, but communications as an academic discipline was formally established over 100 years ago. So the formal academic discipline of communication is relatively new compared to some other traditions. So Corax and Tisius, this is a brief history lesson. It's more informational than anything. I'm not going to test you on any of this stuff, but I think it's interesting to understand the origins of rhetoric. Essentially, Corax is contributed as the founder of rhetoric in 466 BC. Tisius was a pupil of Corax. They were actually, so Corax and Tisius were among the first sophists who were only really concerned with probability of the truth as a means of persuasion. And they placed greater emphasis on the eloquence of speaking rather than the scientific evidence or the logic or, showing proof in a presentation. So essentially, when rhetoric or public speaking gets a negative connotation, it's because Corax and Tisius, they placed more emphasis on the eloquence of speaking rather than the truth of the message. And so, if you think of your modern day lawyer or, the legal system, much of it is just the eloquence and the persuasion, and they get a negative connotation because at times it seems that there's more emphasis placed on the style and delivery rather than the validity of the arguments and the truth. So both are equally important. So if you were to ask me, I think it's really important for establishing three critical areas, and I'll discuss these in just a moment. So there you go, Corax and Tisius. So let's take a look at some of the communication models. We see this Aristotle's linear communication model in which we have a speaker and they have some sort of speech that's influenced by the occasion, such as why are we giving a presentation? Who's the audience? Is it a celebratory speech? Is it, a legal case? Is it a presentation to inform people? Is it a sales pitch? All of those things. So that's the occasion. We have the audience, the people listening to our message, and then we have the effect. What type of effect does the speech and our message have on an audience? So it's very linear. It's almost like a cause and effect. So we have the speaker, the speech, the occasion, the audience, and then some sort of effect. The contemporary communication model looks something like this, where we have a speaker and the listener or the audience, and they're simultaneously sending and receiving messages. So even if you're listening to a presentation, you're still giving off visible feedback. And this would include maybe your body posture, your nonverbal behavior. So eye contact, facial expressions, body posture, all of those things have communicative value. So the speaker can view those behaviors as communication and interpret them. So case in point, when I'm typically lecturing in class or we're facilitating class, I typically don't need to look at the time or keep track of time in class because I already can know when time's up because students start packing up their materials, right? They shut their books, they start packing up their backpacks, and I already know, like, okay, I have like 10 minutes before class ends. They're just mentally checked out. And so that's my cue to kind of, wrap it up for the day. So we're constantly sending and receiving messages. Now, the channel, this line, signifies the different ways we can communicate. So think of all the different ways you can send a message. You could, send a message face to face if the person is in your temporal and spatial boundaries. So if they're, in real time, you could communicate face to face. But we know that technology is advancing. That allows us to transcend some of those spatial and temporal boundaries. So, from a historical perspective, we use smoke signals, we used carrier pigeons, we used the telegraph, we used the telephone, we used mail, the postal service, we used all these different things. So today we have the ability to send text messages, emails, record video presentations. So the big key difference is face-to-face and technological mediated communication channels. Now, within the technological or computer mediated communication channels, we have other distinctions, and that is synchronous and asynchronous communication channels. So synchronous communication channels is real time. So if we were on a live Zoom meeting where we would have access to each other's vocal properties, facial expressions, we would communicate in real time. So that is like the closest to face-to-face conversations. But asynchronous communication is when the communication technology has some sort of time gap built into it. So think about text messaging. If I were to text you and you receive that, you could view that text message and then decide whether or not you wanted to respond right away or wait for a few days or a few hours. Whereas in face-to-face conversations, we don't have that luxury. Typically, if we wait that long, it doesn't work. So the channels are just the means by which we communicate a message. Now, Marshall McLuhan made the argument that the channel in of itself, the way we communicate, is a message in of itself. So, this is really important to become an effective communicator, is to really think, okay, what is my message and what would be the effective channel to communicate that? And so going back to some of my research on the CDC and the World Health Organization, using social media to communicate critical information about the public health crisis that we're all facing was a way to reach a particular demographic or the younger people, or to bypass the bureaucracy of trying to disseminate information to all these major sources. They were like, okay, most people, the general public, are spending a ton of time on their phones, on social media, so why not just use that medium to reach the audience more effectively? So again, when you're considering public speaking or how you communicate in your everyday interactions, really think about how is the channel going to influence the message. So don't go break up with someone over a text message, because that's like really rude, right? Maybe you've been on the receiving end of that. Have the decency to call them or sit down and end that relationship. So again, a lot of different channels, and the channels can affect the message. The squiggly lines running down this model is noise. And noise essentially is anything that impedes or blocks a message from being delivered, or noise that can influence our interpretation of a message. So typically there are three categories of noise. external noise, which is just noise within our environment that makes it hard to listen to a message and interpret that message. There's also psychological noise. So this includes maybe insecurities, our thought process, all the concerns that we might have within our minds. That can influence how attentive we are to interpreting a message. We also have physiological noise, such as our body noise or bodily noise. And so sometimes when we're hungry or we're in pain or we're sick or we're sleep deprived, that makes it more difficult to communicate effectively, and vice versa, it makes it more difficult to interpret more accurately. So research has found in interpersonal relationships, typically when people are in bad moods, so when you're grumpy or sleep deprived, they typically interpret their partner's behavior more negatively than what is actually happening. So it's, so in my interpersonal communication classes, we talk about this when confronting conflict. So if we know that we have to engage in some sort of conflict with our partner or resolve an issue, or we're starting to engage in some sort of argument, which is completely natural for relationships, it's always best to make sure that you eliminate these noise. So make sure that the physical noise in the environment is avoided. If if you have a lot of concerns, like try meditating, getting into a good place inside your mind. And then physiologically, like if you're hungry or if you're super tired, like maybe take care of those needs before you engage in conflict with your partner. That might reduce the chances of that conflict spiraling out of control. So again, as public speakers, we want to take into consideration the disposition of our audience. What time of day is my presentation? Are they going to be hungry? Are they going to be tired? What type of noise is going to be in the environment in which I'm speaking? All of these things are really important to take into consideration when preparing and planning to give some sort of speech. So that's noise. And then, of course, we have the oval shapes. These are the environment. This is pretty much everything that we bring to a conversation. It includes our cultural background, our lived experiences, um, you know, everything about us. And when we interact with someone new for the first time, we try to develop this overlap, and that is that shared meaning. So, for example, one of my good friends from grad school, Sasha, she was an international student from Russia, and we completed our master's degree in the same cohort. But the first few conversations we had, a lot of it was just, trying to make sure that we were interpreting each other correctly. So, when I would say like, oh, that was completely gnarly, she would be like, what's gnarly? And so we would have to explain like, okay, when I say this is, the appropriate meaning, and so forth. So it was a really fun experience to getting to know Sasha and just the different communication behaviors, um, and so forth. So anyways, this is the transactional communication model. It's applicable to our interpersonal conversations, but it's also applicable to public speaking as well. So in that model, we essentially went through all of these elements. We have the speaker, the person who is presenting an oral message. We have the message, which is, developing a message for intended audience. We have the channel, which is the way we can communicate or deliver that message. We have the listener, the person receiving the message. We get feedback. Again, this is the nonverbals of the person receiving the message. If they look confused or if they're breaking eye contact or looking at their phone, like we interpret that feedback. Interference is noise, anything that impedes or blocks the message. And of course, we have the situation, which is the time and the place and the context of when the speech or conversation occurs. So let's talk a little bit about the similarities and differences between public speaking and conversation. First, we'll start with the similarities. Well, in order to communicate effectively and in order to effectively give a public presentation, we have to organize our thoughts logically. Oftentimes in conversations and public speaking, we tailor a message to fit the audience. So in interpersonal conversations, you probably adapt your communication style based on the other person. So you might communicate differently with your best friend than you do with a parent. We tell a story for maximum impact. So in conversations, we tell a story that has maximum impact on the listener, and then we strive to do that in public speaking as well. We adapt to audience feedback, so we pay attention to the audience or the person that we're speaking to, and we again make adjustments or tailor our communication based on the feedback that we get. Okay, so let's jump into the differences between public speaking and conversations. We know that public speaking is more highly structured than just regular conversations. So, in a conversation, we typically don't, outline our whole conversation. We don't provide an introduction, a body, and a conclusion. Whereas in public speaking, we do have a clear introduction where we communicate, this is what I'm going to be talking about. And then in the body, you address what you're going to be talking about. And then in the conclusion, you say, this is what I just told you about. Let's give you a recap. So very structured, not so much in conversations. Public speaking requires more formal language. Again, because our audience might be, maybe a group of 3 to thousands of people, it's really important to make sure that we are approaching those contexts in a very formal manner. So rule of thumb is, the larger the number of audience, the more formality we're going to bring to that context. So if you're speaking to like 3 people in a small group presentation, chances are the formality is going to be a little bit less, but then again, it's contingent on the context. So, I was in a job interview where there was 6 people on the panel. And so even though that was a small group, it was in a job interview. And so I had to present myself in a very formal manner. But if I'm just presenting something to my colleagues, people who I work with, that tends to be a little bit more informal. So for the sake of this class, we will strive for formality as best as we possibly can to really develop those skills, those professional skills. So there's a caveat. We want to be very formal and use formal language, but we don't want to get too much into jargon. And jargon is just specialized language used by a particular profession. So another key component of effective public speaking is adapting to your audience. And so if, let's say, you are a doctor, like a medical doctor, and you're giving a presentation to your colleagues or other doctors, yeah, you could totally use jargon because chances are they're going to be on that same page. Now, if you were a doctor and you were given a presentation to maybe the business side of the hospital or other stakeholders who might not be familiar with the everyday jargon that is relevant to what you do, then you have to tailor your message. Or, the easiest example is like, think of your audience. So would you speak the same way to a bunch of, peers in a college classroom, the same way you would speak to a bunch of 5th graders? And chances are, no, you would probably tailor your language. Public speaking requires a different method of delivery than that of casual interpersonal conversations. And so we see that conversations tend to be more casual, and so this could include like our body posture. It could be our vocalized pauses. So usually in conversations we say or we take a long time getting our ideas out, and so forth. Within public speaking, the delivery has to be concise and professional. And so oftentimes in public speaking, in this class, we will be rehearsing our speeches many times before we actually record or present the speech so that we can really fine tune that delivery to create the best, concise, to the point, effective presentation. So let's go ahead and take a brief moment and look at the elements of public speaking. These are called the rhetorical canons or principles developed by Aristotle. There are 5, and even though they're not explicitly stated in the textbook, I think they're very relevant to public speaking because obviously they're the rhetorical principles. So the first principle is invention. And so Aristotle would argue that invention includes ethos, pathos, and logos, and discovering the best available means of persuasion. So when you're sitting down thinking about a speech topic, thinking about how you're going to approach the audience with this topic, you want to think about what would be the best way to convince or to communicate this topic to my audience. And so this might include, well, maybe using visuals, such as a PowerPoint presentation, or maybe it's using very colorful descriptive language, or maybe telling a story that connects with what I'm trying to communicate to the audience so that it has a deeper impact on them. So invention is the very first principle. Second is arrangement, how to organize our presentation. So typically moving forward from here on out in this semester, every speech, every presentation that you give in this class and every other class or presentation you give in the rest of your life, always, 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 always include an introduction, a body, and a conclusion, right? I'm still surprised on how many of my colleagues and peers and just professional people forget that last one, the conclusion. You know, like they just like, okay, that's it, I'm done. And you're just like, really? Like, that's how you're going to use the last few precious moments you have with your audience. You're just going to say, that's it, I'm done. So arrangement, how to organize for maximum impact. And then 3, style. This is selecting the right words, constructing sentences that are appropriate for the speaker, the audience, the message, and the occasion. So style really is something that you can personalize, and so we all have a different style of communication, and so you want to identify that and see how that you can grow your communication style that's effective and appropriate for a variety of contexts. 4th is memory. This is the ability to hold ideas in our head for a long period of time. And so even though I'm not expecting us to memorize verbatim, like word for word, our presentations, we should know the topic to the point that we could have a conversation with anyone about our topic. And by virtue of that, we could, engage in this extemporaneous type of delivery where it feels natural. So I am going to admit to something that's probably really horrible that I shouldn't, but this presentation right now, I have not rehearsed. So even though that I teach public speaking, every semester, like right now, I didn't really rehearse. I just started recording and I'm talking to you about this stuff, right? That is because I know the topic to the point that I can have a casual conversation with you about it. But if I had to, I could create a very formal, well-structured presentation or speech based on these principles as well. So memory is just being able to hold those ideas in our minds. And then delivery. This is the proper use of voice, gestures, and body movements. So this includes both nonverbal and verbal elements. So we'll explore in later on the semester how we can use our body posture, our facial expressions, our vocalics, such as our tone of voice, our pitch, how loud or soft our voice is, to add a layer of dynamism, or to create more dynamic presentation. So a lot of times our delivery has more of an emotional impact on the audience than the actual content of our speeches. So we'll be taking a look at that. Okay, so this last little bit of today's presentation is looking at developing confidence. So stage fright, public speaking anxiety is completely normal. You are not the only one who experiences anxiety and stage fright. In fact, I still experience it, especially on the first day of classes when I walk into a new classroom with a room full of new faces. It kind of freaks me out. Research shows that public speaking before a group is one of the most common fears. Some other research has found that it's even ranked higher than financial hardship, loneliness, and extreme cases death. So in those extreme cases, people would rather be in the coffin than giving the eulogy at a funeral. And I don't know about you, but I don't think that's true for me. Like, okay, like maybe I give a crappy presentation. Oh well, like I'll live to see another day. But it is a very real experience for some people, that public speaking anxiety. So this is McCrowski. He spent a lot of his communication research career studying communication apprehension and communication or public speaking anxiety. So communication apprehension is just the level of anxiety with communication situations. So some of us probably have communication apprehension, but in a particular context. So for me, growing up, it was answering the phone or speaking over the phone, especially with strangers. So as an adult, I had to learn how to overcome that apprehension. So scheduling a doctor's appointment, or calling IT because, Canvas wasn't working or Blackboard wasn't working, or, calling, uh, the mechanic, or, all these different things, like, was very difficult. My heart would race. I would feel like I was out of breath. And so that's something that, I had to work through. So public speaking anxiety is a form of state apprehension. So again, state apprehension is just associated with a particular communication context. For me, it was speaking over the phone. For others, it's public speaking. For maybe other people, it's having, a one-on-one conversation, or, speaking in front of a group. So there we go. State apprehension is fear of communication only in a certain communication situation. So public speaking anxiety is a real thing, but how do we deal with that nervousness or that anxiety? Well, the very first approach that we could look at is acquiring speaking experiences. This is like systematic desensitization. The more you do something, the more comfortable you will be in that context. So again, public speaking, people hate it. And as a result, they avoid situations to develop those skills. And the only way we can develop our skills is by doing something. So in this environment, in COM 100, this is a safe place for you to engage in these experiences and opportunities to present speeches in a very supportive a supportive context. Like, I want you to grow in these skills. I want you to acquire experience. That way, when you get out into the professional context, or maybe into other classes where your grade or your potential, job is on the line, I want you to be able to be successful in those situations. So research has shown that people who lack basic communication skills tend to experience greater apprehension. Another way we could reduce that uncertainty or the anxiety is to prepare. The more time that you spend practicing and preparing your speeches, the less nervous you will feel. So practice makes perfect. And again, we see other research showing that preparation and developing experiences helps reduce those apprehension, that communication apprehension. Another thing that we could do moving forward is to really change that inner dialogue or that self-talk, so that intrapersonal communication, to reflect more positive thinking. The reason why we want to think more positively, and this is called cognitive modification, is because cognitive science has found that there is a intersection between our thoughts, behaviors, and feelings. So our thought process will significantly influence our behavior. And the things that we do, our behavior, will influence how we feel. And we know that our feelings will influence our thoughts. So they're all, again, there's an intersection between all of these three components. And so when we can start changing our thought process, then we can have a little bit more control over our behavior and our feelings. And so, again, I want you to think that this is a safe environment. This is where you get to expose yourself to the opportunity to develop some of these skills in a low risk environment, so that way you can figure out what works, what doesn't. There'll be challenges, there'll be setbacks, there'll be potential failures, but that's okay. I'd rather have all of us experience these things in this environment, because that's why we're here. We're here to learn, right? We're here to grow. So a lot of it is just changing our mindset so that we can approach these speeches and the homework and the tools and really develop our skill set. This points to the self-fulfilling prophecy. And again, this is similar to the cognitive modification, or that cognitive triangle. And self-fulfilling prophecies, if you haven't learned about them in psychology or other classes, it's essentially that our beliefs will influence our expectations. And so if we think that we're not good at public speaking, and we enroll in a public speaking class, our expectations for that class is that it's going to be a horrible experience, right? And that's going to influence our behavior in a way that makes the predicted results more likely to occur. So beliefs, expectations, behavior, results. So if you believe public speaking is not your thing, you aren't good at it, it freaks you out, then you're going to expect COM 100, or this public speaking class, to be an unpleasant experience. It's going to be difficult. It's not your thing, so it's going to be super challenging. That's going to influence your behavior, so you might not be as fully invested or committed to learning and growing. And as a result, that might result in a bad grade, and then that bad grade is going to reinforce that initial belief, right? So I want you to start changing that self-talk, or maybe negative beliefs you have about public speaking, about yourself, and about this class. So that way you can really change your expectations behavior in a way that makes your results more positive. Okay, so lastly, what makes a good speech? As we move forward in the semester, we will be focused on three basic things, and that is developing good ideas, developing good structure, and developing good delivery techniques. So so that's going to be the premise of this semester. So if you were to ask me what makes an excellent speech, I would say having good ideas. Well, how do you develop good ideas? They just don't come to us overnight. We spend a lot of time reading, researching, and that's where the good ideas come from. Okay, what makes a good structured speech? Well, a speech has an introduction, a body, and a conclusion. Those are the basic, I'm saying, the very minimum, your speech should have those three. But we're going to explore, well, what goes in the introduction? How do you structure the introduction for, to make a great impact on the audience? How to structure your main points, how to structure a conclusion. all of that is really important for developing a solid speech. And then and then the last one is developing good delivery techniques, how to communicate confidence and effectiveness in our presentation. So I typically am a realist when it comes to public speaking. Like we aren't like I still suck at public speaking. Like at least that's my perception. I don't know if that's residual from my past insecurities, or self-doubt, but I don't think I'm the best public speaker. I don't think I have the best ideas, right? But when I do have good ideas, but lack structure and delivery, no one's going to listen to those ideas. Or maybe my ideas are half baked or half developed or underdeveloped, but I have really good structure and really good delivery. Great, I might have some sort of impact on the audience, but the idea isn't good enough to make a profound difference in the audience. And if I only just have good delivery but don't have good structure or substantial content, then, I might be like a used car salesperson, right? So we want a balance between these three. We want good ideas, we want good structure, and we want good delivery skills. So my hope is that we identify one of these areas that we're most lacking in. So maybe that's our research skills, or maybe that's our organizational skills, or maybe that's our delivery skills. And I want us to focus on developing that area. So some other things we could include in our speeches to make a good speech are the inartistic and artistic proofs. According to Aristotle, our inartistic proofs are just external elements that we bring into our speech. So this is like citing research, citing resources or sources or references from external things like websites, books, research articles, quotes. All of that adds to the presentation, makes for a good presentation. If I only talk about my experiences or what I think is right, then there's really no validity to that. And so we want to back it up with empirical evidence, our topics. And then the artistic proofs. This is the ethos, pathos, and logos, the credibility, the emotional appeal, and the logical progression of our speeches. So visually, this is what it looks like. A great speech consists of great ideas, great structure, and great delivery. So we see that here. So developing great ideas, we will focus on, developing a narrow topic and developing our ideas through research. Great structure, we'll look at what goes in the introduction, the body, and conclusion, and then great delivery. So we'll look at the nonverbal and verbal elements of our delivery. So in this presentation, we looked at the origins of rhetoric, the basic communication models. We looked at the basic communication process. We looked at similarities and differences between conversations and public speaking. And we also looked at public speaking anxiety and communication apprehension, different methods we could do to reduce those anxious feelings. And again, this is something that I'll continue to speak on as we move through the semester, such as deep breathing, how to do a power pose, all of those things. Thank you so much for listening to this Chapter 1 presentation, and we'll see you next time.